Good morning, afternoon, evening, night, of course, depending where in the world you are. It's always a content. Where in the world you are in space and time, perhaps you're listening to this at a later date. Why do we date? Why do we choose who we date? Got the bug going around in the house right now, which of course is a drag. Baby Maya's first cold. It's really sad seeing her go through that, but she's doing better with it than I did or tend to. I'm just getting to the other side now, and so it's mom's turn. And so that's just been interesting to witness. I was pretty laid out with this cold this last week, a few days. Maybe Thursday, Friday, Saturday were my worst. And then Maya's been sick. But Anna's been fighting it off. This morning at 4 a.m., I woke up with a baby getting pushed at me. It's like, hey, Maya's not sleeping. I need to sleep. I have a fever. So now it's Anna's turn. So I got up and Maya and I went for a walk in the fog, and she did really well. We did a good job together to get the boy up and off to school and all that, and hopefully Maya got back to sleep with mom. So that's where we're at, and I'm guessing that it's gonna be a few days of mom really out and about. Okay, well, what does this have to do with opposites attract? Maybe we can take that statement astrological in a moment, but just say I've been like learning these interesting things, like scientific studies on attraction to those whom we share different disease markers with. I'm not going to state this eloquently or precisely, pardon me for that. And also attraction to people who respond to viruses and bacterias in a different way than we do. So that latter one Anna had told me yesterday. The former one I'd heard online at some point, and if my memory serves, there was an experiment like this where they had a bunch of people like sweat into t-shirts after doing some gene testing on them, and then they had other folks smell those shirts and suggest just by the smell who was hot, like who was attractive. And the results proved the hypothesis that was set forth for this study, which is that people will be attracted to others who have different like genetics. I mean, you can see that I lack the biological vocabulary to express this eloquently, but I think you're getting what I'm trying to get across. I mean, if that's true, that's a pretty intriguing thing, right? Because we're attracted to them. You're like, wow, their poetry, their wisdom, their beauty, their elegance, their groundedness, like whatever, you know? And at different times in our lives, we're attracted for different reasons. You know, many people will choose not to have children. Many people are unable to have children, right? Would this attraction factor still be based upon progeny if children aren't in the cards for that person or for their partner or whatever? Many people aren't even inclined towards monogamy, right? it still would this apply? It's like a really interesting thing to consider. This would be a really amazing thing to do with astrology charts. Now, if I was some sun sign astrologer and just said, oh, Scorpio is a good match with, I don't know. I don't even know. I mean, I can just say by the geometries, maybe we would say Cancer or Pisces because of the trines and the common triplicity, which you may know is the element of water, you know. I know that astrology charts are far too complex to even study the idea of what sun sign should go with what sun sign. That is like, it's just not how astrology works as far as any of those of us who have been deep in the study are concerned. I shouldn't speak for anyone but myself, but I feel like my peers would be happy to be represented in that statement. We could, however, still divide some experiments, right? I mean, we could get together a bunch of people who were born with Libra rising and therefore Aries setting, and then know that Mars would signify the relational partner, right? And we could see what happens in attraction if Mars is in Aries or whatever it might be, right? But it's pretty cool. That's like a really cool experiment of like just working with pheromones, right? Does anybody heard of that experiment that I'm speaking of? We're hearing that a Scorpio moon feels they would like to be with another Scorpio moon or Pisces moon. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so that's an interesting thing to consider. I mean, speaking of sun signs, my partner, Scorpion, and I are both Scorpio suns. You know, and that can be dramatic, but for the most part, we get on well, and I think we see the world through similar eyes. We dig into different rabbit holes for sure. We're both very intent upon personal and collective transformation. I've seen that expressed in like stages in my life. But yeah, it really depends on the chart, you know, like we want the moon to be satisfied for all of us. But the relationship thing, like I was taught initially that's about Venus and Mars. Like I see it much more of a first house, seventh house, or first house, fifth house thing these days. All right, but you know, opposites attracting, that, let me just end there. It's intriguing to consider a couple things. One, by sign, the first and the seventh, which we speak of as the houses of relationship, the first being me and the seventh being the other. Right, so let me say a little before we take that further. One of the principal differences between modern astrology and traditional astrology is that modern astrology is similar to psychological parts work, right? Where we are composed of these many characters. We're all schizos and kind of getting right with our many beings and who's driving the bus at any given time, and you know, making sure that somebody doesn't always have their hand on the wheel, whatever. Right, so modern astrology kind of sees Mercury as your mind, Venus as your heart, and Mars as your will, and that. I mean, I think most of you are very familiar with that setup. And it's brilliant and beautiful and can really open profound revelations. And I like working with that as well. It's working with the traditional view where really you are represented by one planet. Now, which planet that is, it can be tricky. The simplest scenario is simply the planet that represents the sign that was rising when you were born. So, for example, I was born with Gemini rising, and therefore Mercury is said to be the lord of my horoscope, to use the old language, or said to be the steersman of my life's journey. The ascendant is the rudder, and the planet that, to use the modern term, rules that sign is the steersman of the life, right? So that's maybe the simplest way to get after it. There, throughout the tradition, were other approaches. It kind of depends where in the chart the steersman of the chart is. If he's blind to the ascendant, you might look for another planet, and some would look for the principal triplicity lord of the ascendant. And it gets complex, especially if we look at some of the Hellenistic considerations where they're looking for, the victor of the chart and other interesting things, or in like the medieval time looking for the Almutine, which is kind of like the planet that has the most juice, and then that's going to be the planet that literally represents you and is kind of guiding your life, your vitality, your health, your body. And then all of the other planets in your chart represent other people. And so that's like another brilliant and beautiful way to work with the chart, And I mean, we can get to, I don't know, your boss's, spouse's, lover's cat, you know what I'm saying, in your chart if we want to. I'm not sure why we would. But who in your chart represents your children? If you have 3, who represents the eldest and the youngest and the middle one? Who represents your husband and your second husband, right? Who represents your uncles and your nieces? And we'll have planets that kind of show up, and then we can look at the relationship between the planet that represents you and the planet that represents another in your life, like your spouse, and that will help us understand more about the way that you do relationship. And so if relationship stuff's alive for you, as many will suggest it's meant to be at this time in our lives with Venus retrograde, right? It's helpful to know which planet in the nativity significates the other and significates the native, significates you and your lover, partner, spouse, whatever it may be, or simply your relationship to relationship itself. Now, if you look at that dynamic of the first house and the 7th house, so this is the relationship axis, the me and the we, or the me and the other. An interesting thing to see is that they will always be of the same polarity, right? So in astrology, we have polarity, triplicity, and quadruplicity. Now, these days, quadruplicity is typically expressed as modality, right? So these are the 4 sets of 3. Right, so no, the 3 sets of 4, that'd be a better way to say that, right? Quadruplicity, the 3 sets of 4. So there's 4 cardinal signs, there's 4 fixed signs, there's 4 mutable signs, right? Triplicity, the 4 sets of 3, right? So there's 3 fire signs, 3 earth signs, 3 air signs, and 3 water signs, right? Those are the triplicities. And then there's polarities. There's 2 sets of 6 diurnal signs, 6 nocturnal signs. I prefer to say them that way. Many will teach them as yang and yin, or masculine and feminine. A thing that you won't hear often these days, although it was like the first way they would describe the polarities not too long ago, and those were the positive and the negative signs. And when you think of polarity, actually, sorry, I shouldn't speak for you. When I think of polarity, I'm often also having somewhat of a science background and engineer training. I'm thinking of electricity and circuits and such, right? And actually, if you use that model, exploring the astrology, some really interesting things come in. Now, you can't speak about polarity without being totally polarizing. It's like a dangerous thing to do. And so I like to really joke about that when I teach this in my classes. So, I mean, consider, for example, that the set of 6 signs that some call feminine are the same 6 that some call negative. Whereas the set of 6 signs that some call masculine are the same 6 that some call positive. So are you telling me that it's positive to be masculine and negative to be feminine? Now that's polarizing shit. And that's going to get you into a lot of trouble. You know, maybe I should just rewind the tape and scrub that bit out, right? But when I do this, I like to really work with color in a way. First, I'll show like and feminine, and I'm like, well, that's just ridiculously sexist. But at that point, I'm using red to denote the so-called masculine signs, and you all know that means the fire and air signs, and I'll use black to denote the so-called feminine signs, and as you all know, that means the earth and the water signs, right? Well, why would I use red and black? Because I want to invoke this electrical model. And if you've ever wired a socket in a house, you know that the black cord is your friend and the red cord is dangerous. It's said to be hot, interestingly. Like, that's what's said of this, what I prefer to know as the diurnal signs. The fire and the air signs, fire being hot and dry, and the air being hot and wet, or warm and moist, we often say, the caloric and the sanguine temperaments, right? So basically diurnal, right? When the sun is above the ground, that's that diurnal expression of warm, or when the sun is below the ground, that's the nocturnal expression, right? And so for me, I'm always trying to bring these into like experiences of nature, and that's why I prefer to know these 2 sets of the poles as diurnal and nocturnal, because it's something I'm like much more experienced with, and it tends to get you in less trouble than talking about positive signs and negative signs, or masculine signs and feminine signs, especially if you tie those things together. However, if we want to talk about opposites attracting, it can be really helpful to look at this electrical or even like a magnetic model. Now, for those of you who study the physics, it's about electromagnetic principles, right? You don't have electricity without having magnetism, and vice versa. They're not the same thing, but they are never separated. All right, so yeah, I like thinking in this regard of the so-called negative signs, right, which, you know, you'll know likely as the earth and water signs, as grounded. Now that's what they are. Why will that black cord not kill you? Because it's literally grounded. If your house is wired right, you have that whole circuit, all the electricity in your house is grounded to like a stake, a metal stake in the ground, in the earth. Why in the earth? Because the earth is moist. By temperament, by the way, it's not, it's cold and dry, but I mean, in the actual ground, in the earth itself, there is wetness, there is water, right? And that dissipates the electricity. I mean, it just forms really the pole of the other side of the circuit. So the hot pole is like the electricity coming in from the power plant or whatever, and then the cold pole is the stake grounded in the earth. Look, remember when getting grounded was a bad thing when we were kids or whatever? Now it's like one of the ultimate goals, and it's, you know, it's one of the great principles of these nocturnal signs, of the earth and the water signs, of the down and in signs, right? They help us land, be in the body, connect, be in the heart that lives in the body. These are all beautiful things. So negative does not mean bad. It does not mean lesser than. It means opposite. And I really like contemplating this electric model where we then get grounded, because it really helped me through a question asked by one of the students of an earth astrology class some time ago. Really helped me see how the world goes around, because I had always wondered, like when I was just initially taught the words feminine and masculine for the earth and water versus the air and fire signs respectively, it was always interesting for me to see all of the 6 relationship axes. I mean, really there's 12, but we can look at Aries rising, Libra setting in a similar way as Libra rising, Aries setting, right? So we have 4 3s, 3 4s, 2 6s, and also 6 2s in astrology. And that's the brilliance of the abundance of the number of creation, which is 12. So I would always wonder, well, that's interesting. Why in the relationship axis is it always a masculine sign paired with a masculine sign, like Aries fire and Libra air, or a feminine sign and a feminine sign, like Taurus earth and Scorpio water? You're only ever going to see it that way. And like that opens interesting contemplations and confusions. And, you know, more and more these days, it's just not polite to talk about that stuff, and you'll get canceled and all those things. Like, it seems to be settling down a bit. But it also just, like, all that aside, like, it's hard to take that much further. When you look at this electrically, though, or magnetically, things become really interesting. So it was cool at the end of a polarity transmission once in the School of Earth Astrology. A student asked, well, why would the 2 signs on a relationship axis then always have the same charge? Because opposites attract. So why would you have the relationship axis of the 1st house and the 7th house, let's say Cancer rising and Capricorn setting, be negative and negative? Or the Leo rising and Aquarius setting be positive and positive? Shouldn't the opposites attract? It's a cool question. But I kind of instantly saw the problem with if you set it up that way, right? You would have opposite charges in each of the 6 poles or 6 axes in the zodiac. The whole thing would just collapse instantaneously and the world would have never begun. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, it's not just the 1st house and the 7th house that are opposite. Let's choose a rising sign. So, well, Scorpio came in earlier. So let's say Scorpio rising. If Scorpio rising, what sign is setting? And of course, the answer is Taurus, right? So, and I'm going to use these terms, and please don't in any way think I'm implying bad. Negative. So we have negative on the 1st and negative on the 7th. Well, that means we're going to have positive on the 2nd and the 8th, right? If Scorpio is rising, then Sagittarius is on the 2nd. fire, positive. If Taurus is setting, then Gemini is on the 8th, air, positive, right? And then the 3rd and the 9th, of course, eternally opposite. They'll be negative, negative in that case. The 4th and the 10th will be positive, positive. The 5th and the 11th will be negative, negative. And the 6th and the 12th will be positive, positive. I mean, you just get in any way, in any time, in the design, you're going to get the chart set up in such a way that negative is opposite of negative, positive is opposite of positive, and there'll be 6 pairs like this. So that instead of promoting collapse through this like undeniable and impreventable attraction, right, where everything just like collapses into a singularity, what are you going to get instead? Expansion. And excuse me, maybe more interestingly, you will see how the world turns. Because if the first is a negative sign, then the 12th and the 2nd will be positive signs. So that's where the attraction is, right? So let's use that case again, Scorpio rising. If Scorpio's rising, then Libra has just risen, right? And Sagittarius is about to rise. Well, Libra, air, positive sign. Scorpio, water, negative sign. Sagittarius, fire, positive sign, right? And so all you have to do is give the wheel a nudge in one direction or the other, and it's just going to be an eternal magnet free energy device. It's just going to eternally spin. Do you see how this makes the world go round? And it will never stop. Beautiful, right? So it was when I was creating that polarity course, you know, I was really challenged at the time of like, well, do I even want to go here? Do I want to talk about positive and negative signs? I mean, frankly, I had just ignored that language altogether. I had been advised to like ignore any patriarchal language and try to memory hole it and like Orwellian erase it, right? And replace it. But if we get back to the original intent of the language, we often find that it's actually not some patriarchal thing. So, for example, superior and inferior planets, or let's say conjunction. So Venus is now retrograde. Venus will have her inferior conjunction with the sun. Well, that means Venus between Earth and the sun. Whereas in about 9.5 months, Venus will go behind the sun from Earth's point of view and have her superior conjunction with the sun. Now, that's the astronomical language. Now, I was taught, and I like these words because in some regards they make more sense, to replace inferior and superior with interior and exterior. Well, it just makes a lot of sense. When Venus is retrograde conjuncts the sun, as she will be in March 23rd, I guess. That's literally Venus between Earth and the sun, interior to Earth's orbital path. And then later, when Venus conjoins the sun in Capricorn, which will be in January 26th, Venus will literally be behind the sun, like exterior, not to Earth's path, but like exterior to the sun. But maybe interior and exterior should be about Earth's path. I mean, by the way, that's also a different way that inferior and superior are used astronomically. But the whole point that I want to get to here is that interior and exterior, you know, that's the beautiful. It has so much connotation inside and outside, and it doesn't necessarily feel bad, good, whatever. Whereas inferior and superior, it's hard not to go there without thinking like inferior is lesser than or worse, and superior is greater than or better, right? I mean, that's just kind of in that language. And so this is one of the reasons why one of my first teachers just like is purging that kind of language from astrology. That teacher, by the way, also doesn't work with rulerships. It feels like that kind of idea of essential dignity, and especially the other image of that, which they call essential debility. I don't like that word at all. Like tells you that like Venus, for example, would be weak in Aries where Venus is in now. I don't believe that's true. But I do believe that Venus in Aries is a bit counterculture. It's different than, you know, what the culture is like wishing Venus would be, and it makes it a little bit more difficult to cruise through life in that way. Not, and that's not bad. Like, we want challenges in life to respond to so we can be us and real. I think in some regards perhaps Venus would be most successful at individuating in Aries. And I'll be speaking about that at Storytelling Hour later today in a few hours at 11:33 a.m. Pacific time, as I do on Wednesdays. I should just say about that, by the way, that Storytelling Hour today was going to feature a conversation between myself and my incredibly attractive partner, because we get sick at different times. If you weren't here for the beginning of this flow, you might say, what the hell are you talking about? Well, rewind. Um, Anna is sick right now, though, so she might be choosing to lay it out. And if so, then I'll probably share some of the slides I shared with the Cosmic Intelligence Agency recently, and I will definitely offer um, my kind of the timeline of the Venus moon gates and such, as I do each Venus cycle. All right, well, I want to take inferior and superior back. I will likely still lean towards using the terms interior and exterior because they just don't carry the weight of misinterpretation. Because really, inferior just means below and superior means above. And that actually makes a ton of sense for those two types of Venus-Sun conjunctions I was just describing before. Is Venus below the sphere of the Sun or above the sphere of the Sun? And maybe I shouldn't state it that way, because if you know that whole Ptolemaic universe, as they call it, not that Ptolemy started that image, Venus can never be above the sphere of the Sun. But, you know, below and above, those don't sound to me to be like winning and losing words or good and bad words. So we just need to be careful not to just throw out language. Or like people will not use the word discrimination anymore. We've been asked to replace that with discernment. But that's because we've been programmed to believe that discrimination equals racism, sexism, and whatnot. And like, no, racism is racism, and it's terrible, right? Sexism is sexism, and it's terrible. But discrimination is the thing that keeps you from walking off a cliff, right? Discrimination is the ability to separate using the powers of mind. Whereas discernment, I would suggest, is the abilities to separate and choose using the powers of feel. And I don't want those, personally for me, I don't want to conflate those terms because I lose that separation between head and heart. Now, I want those things to come together, don't get me wrong there, but it's separate and bring together in the alchemist's formula. All right, well, I didn't mean to go off on this whole piece, but hopefully it speaks to something that you've also considered. And, you know, I do see the great challenges that will result if we just destroy words because we are uncomfortable with the ways that they are used. And if we simply get back to their meaning and to their root, we can actually reclaim their powers. I listened to somebody on the TV screen the other day say using elevated vocabulary is itself racist. What? I want to read what Weird Olive adds here. Inferior and superior are regularly used that way in biology too. If we keep replacing words because we assign value judgments to them, we'll just apply value judgments to the new words too. That's a really good point. And eventually we'll eradicate so many words we don't have anything left to say. Huh. I guess Mercury's in Aries too, and about to retrograde. So I want to finish this by looking at opposites attract now from a temperamental point of view. And this would work more with the houses, the angles, than it would with the signs. And I should say that I will be teaching an amazing 5-week course on the heavenly houses. It's called Cosmic Keys to the Heavenly Houses. Now the enrollment period is closed, but I didn't really know it worked that way. So pardon me, I had a text conversation with Nadia Shaw, who's been really gracious enough to invite me to teach this course at her Synchronicity University. And that's coming up. It's starting on the equinox on March 20th, 2025, and it will run for 5 consecutive Thursdays. Live, of course, everything will be recorded. And I'm also going to do 4 or 5 community discussions, likely in the Saturdays during the midst as well, so we can really connect. And there's more than 100 people signed up already. Casey, I see you wrote that you're so excited for it. I am so excited that you're so excited for it. Anyway, I know we'll be able to open up like another enrollment period for it. So please just be on my mailing list if you're interested in the course. And you can find my mailing list. Sign up at my website, which is GeminiBrett.com. Brett with twin T's. Okay. And I got to get to work on this thing because this cold has set me back. And now Anna's cold is going to have me being like more on demand with baby than otherwise. And it's my time to step up and be a good papa and a good partner. So I'll find the time to get this right. Everything's here in the vision, and a lot of it's kind of been created, and I'm just like making it more beautiful. I really like to express these things not only through the philosophy and the poetry, but visually and through the beauty, especially when we're teaching astronomy and sacred geometry, which is a significant part of the cosmic keys to the heavenly houses. All right. Anyway, temperament, like making things natural, is a huge piece of this. I've been speaking about this on the channel recently. And so a way to just like follow the sun from rise to reach to rest to root, okay? The morning, let's talk about like the midday. Hot and dry, caloric, fire. The sun is on high, right? Well, the sun sets, it's still hot. But now we're going into the cold. The sun sets, and gosh, well, Anna and I had this really cool one. Well, it was a really hot one, and then it was a really cool one. Just last week, I was like, gosh, should we turn the heat pump on and get some air conditioning going on? It's like it's burning hot in here. And she's like, no, the sun's about to set. Wisdom. And then the sun set, and it was cold, like right away. You've all experienced it, you know? And that's the shift from the caloric to the melancholic temperament, or from fire to earth, right? So sun of the midheaven, fire, sun of the descendant, earth. Coming into the dry, it's still dry, but now it's cold. In the middle of the night, and you can feel it in your bones when the sun hits the roots and the sun hits the IC, now cold and wet, right? And there's just this instantaneous change from dang, it's cold to oh my gosh, it's dang cold, because you're now melancholic and phlegmatic, like the water is surrounding you like a blanket, like a wet blanket. And that's the sun moving through the third and the second and the first house until it rises. And then we're still wet, right? Morning dew. And that's the sanguine, or the air-like time. So if you prefer elements, the east is like air, the midheaven is like fire, the descendant is like earth, and the IC is like water, right? The ascendant is like air. I said east before. Ascendant, eastern horizon, descendant, western horizon kind of go hand in hand. As far as the midheaven and the IC, it depends on where on earth you're engaging with the heavenly happenings from. So back to the first house, seventh house opposition. I mean, if we look by signs, we can get, for example, like Aries and Libra. It's kind of the classic pole to examine in that first, seventh regard. And you get, speaking of polarity, let's go back to this idea of positive sign, opposite of a positive sign. And, you know, that those don't attract, opposites attract, they actually repel. But again, for me, that's a promoting expansion over collapse. And the attraction will be to the neighboring sign, and that just makes the wheel go round and around, the wheel of life. But if we look at this from a temperament perspective, and we could do this with signs. I could say like, okay, Aries, fire, Libra, air. So we're talking about hot and dry, fire, and hot and wet. And so they're both hot, right? But there is a thing that attracts, which is the dryness and the wetness. Do you see? Or if we use the other possibility, which would be a earth sign and a water sign, well, earth, cold and dry, water, cold and wet, they're both cold, but it's they have dry and wet again, or dry and moist. So there's something really considering when we get out of elemental consideration or polarity consideration alone, and open that open that a little bit further into this idea of temperament. You see there's something shared, but something opposite still. And that's an intriguing thing to consider. If we just look generally between the East, if we follow the sun as a nature of warm and moist air, and the West is cold and dry, well, now you get moist versus dryness, and warm versus cold, like they're opposite in both ways. Now that can never happen with sign elements as we use them in astrology. The way that we use elements in astrology, in the zodiacal order of elements, it's an intriguing thing. You don't see that in any of the other kind of approaches to elements through density, etc. So anyway, that's a lot. By the way, I keep mentioning this class. If you want to see that polarity class and a ton of other fundamentals, as I call them, of Earth astrology, you can download the entire golden year of classes at my website at GeminiBread.com. Go to the courses page and check out the golden year. If you're good with going through pre-recorded material, be a great place to be. I have since been called to really start from the beginning and build up, and so I've been dreaming into doing just that, and hopefully to do that with my wonderful partner in the years to come. I'm excited to explore this more through a houses basis, feet on the ground basis versus center of the earth sign basis. And again, that'll be coming up in the Cosmic Keys of the Heavenly Houses course. It's currently closed, but it will open up again before the course launches on March 20th. So please be on my mailing list, GeminiBrett.com, to sign up so I can notify you when it's open again. I believe it will be offered for a sliding scale of somewhere between $25 for 5 classes and community discussions, or up to $250. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, share it around. It helps the channel out a lot. That would be greatly appreciated. The present of your presence is a wonderful gift. Thanks for driving and spend some time parking with me. It's time to go check on my ladies. Hopefully they're still sleeping. I wanted to stay out a bit so the barking dog won't wake them up. And finally, I will be back on this YouTube space at 11:33 a.m. Pacific time today, hopefully with Scorpiana, my beloved. Maybe not, hope she's resting, to speak about Venus retrograde, reborn, reburned. What is it about? Hope to see you then, friends. Be well in these crazy ass times.